inviting me. Wonderful memories of Mozambique too. I was also privileged to spend quite a few years in Mozambique. But as you were saying, I was a curator at the African galleries at the British Museum. But before that, I was pitched into all things African at the Museum of Mankind. And that was in 1987, exactly the same year that the Africa Centre was putting on an exhibition of Malangatana's work. And back then at the Museum of Mankind, certainly none of us would have heard of Malangatana. And really, I think people at that stage were not thinking too hard, certainly not in museums, about what became known as contemporary African art. Now I think that term has kind of disappeared, which is great. But I, in a sense, was a fraud. I wasn't a trained anthropologist, I wasn't an archaeologist, I wasn't even an art historian. Somehow I kind of slipped in through the back door. And in some other ways, though, that kind of held me in good stead, because I really felt critical, I suppose, towards some of the exhibitions that we were doing there. I could see that there were elements that were missing. And when it came to the Africa galleries being built at the main British Museum site in Bloomsbury, my senior colleagues, foolishly or not, said to me, well, you can lead. I don't know why they said that, really. Maybe they thought their careers would bomb if they left. Anyway, they left it to me. And I said, well, as an artist, I'm going to introduce our public, not through what they're expecting to see, because back in those days, African art meant to people, mainly wood sculpture, these wonderful masterworks of denim bronzes and textiles and metalwork and so on. But instead I'll introduce them through contemporary artists, artists perhaps working in those fields, but giving a sense of dynamism from the now to the deep past. And only about, I think, a couple of years after the Africa Galleries opened at the British Museum, my friend Elspeth Court, who also worked at SOAS, said to me, you need to go to an exhibition, and not in Africa, but here in the Oxo Tower in London. And it's an exhibition of work by artists from Mozambique. It was a project started up by a wonderful Bishop Sengolani to get some of these many guns that were still left in the country after war was finally banished, in a sense, from Mozambique in 1992. And Bishop Sengolani got artists to turn these weapons that had come out of the bush. They had this wonderful project, give us your guns and we will give you more useful hardware. And artists in Mozambique, in Maputo, turned these guns, these weapons of war, into sculptures. So I went down to the Oxford Gallery. It was a cold January day. I thought, I don't really want to go down there and see these things. And I went in there, I was just knocked out. They were amazing sculptures. One of them in particular, which became known as the Throne of Weapons, was by a Mozambican artist whose name was Kester, and later became a good friend. And I saw this Throne of Weapons, mainly made of AK-47s. But when we got back to the BM, we discovered many more weapons from before the Second World War even, kind of washing around in the arms trade. And I went back and I said, we've got to get this work. It was a bit of a risk, in a sense, to put it into the Africa Galleries, because in some ways it might have been seen as promoting an idea of continuous violence and war in Africa. Instead, it did the kind of complete reverse. It told very much of peace. And Neil McGregor helped by calling it, within 2 years, more iconic than the Rosetta Stone, which really raised the hackles of my Egyptian antiquities scholars. But it was a result. And as a result of that, I said, I want to go to Mozambique. I want to meet Bishop Sengolani. I want to go to Maputo. I want to meet these artists who created these pieces. And I think it was Christian Aid who was sponsoring this whole charity at that time. And a BBC film crew, we all went out to Maputo. And I began to meet the artists. And I remember going to the Natural History Museum and seeing Malangatana's amazing mural there of these wonderful faces. And somehow outside, with the sun in different parts of the sky and vegetation in front of it, it changed and it kind of worked in a different way for every moment of the day. It really struck a chord in me, not just because it was my first introduction to Malangatana's art, but in a way it was very early on in my experience in Mozambique. And from then on, I just spent several years working on and off in Mozambique in various different ways, working in museums in different parts of the country, inevitably having to work at the British Museum. We needed to work with museum colleagues, and that was a privilege too, with Juliet and Matsinde at the National Museum of Art, which I think Malangatana helped to found. Towards the end of my time there, I met Malangatana himself, which was a great privilege. We put together a film of the Tree of Life, which had an introduction which included work by Malangatana and other Mozambican artists. And I knew my old friend Magdalena Dundo, who is an amazing ceramicist and one of the first artists I commissioned for the Africa Gallery. And she had known Malangatana for many years. And she said, "Oh, you're going to see Malangatana?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Give him this pair of socks." Why? Why the pair of socks? He'll know what it means. So I went there and walked into this amazing studio full of Malangatana's works. And he wonderfully said hello and pretty much the first thing I did was to say, "Look, can I just give you this pair of socks, because I've got to do that, and then we can talk." And he fell over in laughter. I still don't know what the was, even though I think, she won't tell me. But it was a lovely introduction to a great artist. And I didn't know Richard Gray had been working for many years by this time, and was a close friend of mine, and was bringing his work to prominence. Okay, it had appeared in collections of works that a book called Angara Africa, and I included his work in that, and his work appeared in various other collections. But so important to have an in-depth study like this of many artists, I think, who people know from these general exhibitions, but they don't know the depth of their work. That for European artists, for example, would be almost without question, once you've had a major exhibition, people will write a detailed biography. And I don't know many that are in this category of what Richard has created. It's such an important book, and it really speaks of not just Malangatana, but I think the many people that he was involved with over the years, bringing not only peace to Mozambique, but a kind of recognition of the wonderful artistry and also I think the great bravery of people in Mozambique who were faced with wars that were not of their own making. It's a great achievement, Richard. Was the sculpture that the four artists I worked with in Maputo and created for the British Museum. It became a kind of symbol for one of those festivals of African art, Africa 05, and it made its way down to the Africa galleries. So that's kind of about me, and it's about Mozambique, it's about Malangatana, and a thank you to Ritchie for this incredible book. I've been panning through it online, and I look forward to holding a weighty copy. I don't know, and my nearest Nando's, and Ealing Commons, is the first Nando's ever in London. So go to the Ealing Common Nando's. And when you get to Ealing Common Station, get on the Piccadilly line up to Park Royal, and round the corner you get to the West London Art Factory where I've got my studio. You'll be very welcome. Many of us.